Hello, Lauri. It's a pleasure talking with you today. I wanted to start with some introductions. So today we're going to be talking about PGT-A+, and my name is Dr. Alyssa Snider. I am the Director of Clinical Genetics at iGenomics. I started with iGenomics, which is now part of VitroLife Group, in 2013 as a genetic counselor. And as I mentioned, I'm now the Director of Clinical Genetic Services. And I have a PhD in genetics, a master's degree in genetic counseling, and through my role in iGenomics VitroLife Group, I have the pleasure of collaborating with Miss Lauri Black. So Miss Lauri Black is the Director of Clinical Genetics at Inception Fertility, which includes the Prelude network of clinics as well as My Egg Bank. Lauri is a genetic counselor by training as well, and she started in reproductive medicine as a genetic counselor in 1998. She's a trailblazer for the community of genetic counselors. She is the founder of the Genetic Counseling Special Interest Group, which has now grown and evolved to become the Genetic Counseling Professional Group. Lauri has a long relationship with iGenomics, supporting us and collaborating with us, guiding us on what good clinical decisions are going to be based off of what clients and patients really want from us. So Lauri, thank you for the long collaboration, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alyssa. I appreciate the invitation to the conversation.
Can you hear her okay?
Okay, I'll speak up.
Where's your mic?
It's right here, I think. Are you guys able to hear me? Is that better? Okay.
Good. So today, Lauri, we're going to be talking about PGT-A+, which is a technology that, of course, screens for aneuploidies in embryos. And it also has the ability to detect ploidy abnormalities, and it has this really special embryo quality control assessments that we can perform, including the contamination detection and the cohort analysis. So thank you again for joining us today.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I'm just curious to hear about your initial thoughts about PGT-A+.
Since you guys launched it last year, I've been very excited about this. I think the most obvious benefit is with the ploidy analysis. I think anybody in reproductive medicine is very aware of the fact that triploidy is a common cause of miscarriage. So adding SNPs to an NGS platform allows for that detection where NGS only triploidy can be missed. So it's a really obvious advantage. It's kind of a no-brainer as far as clinical care goes. But the QC component, I think, is a little bit unique, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Definitely. The sound quality is distracting to me. There is a ringing. Yeah, can we fix this before we continue? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I think it might be because our mics are a little close to one another.
Is that it?
It's a little feedback.
Can we fix it, or should we just continue?
They're
Working on it? Okay. Okay. So as Lauri mentioned, the PGT-A+ does include this additional sequencing of SNPs, or these single nucleotide polymorphisms. And these polymorphisms are different person to person. They help us tell apart chromosomes that we inherited from our mother and our father. And so it allows us to get a sense of how many complete sets of chromosomes are in an embryo. So it allows us to detect ploidy abnormalities, including haploidy and triploidy. In addition to that, we can also see when there is more than one genome in a sample. So if we see more than one genome in a sample, this is what we consider contamination. And so we're worried that that result might not actually correspond to the embryo. And additionally, it also helps us check the genetic relatedness between samples in a cohort. So if the samples originate from embryos that were derived from the same egg and sperm source, we would expect them to have a sibling relationship with each other and to be 50% genetically related. And the SNPs can help us determine that. So Lauri, obviously we're also very excited about this new technology. And I'm curious, from your perspective, working with a network of clinics, how have these clinics been responding to the concept of embryo QC?
You know, I think overall it's been a pretty favorable response. I think one of the exciting things about the QC is the ability to find near misses. meaning you can identify contamination or a cohort inconsistency and have the opportunity to investigate that and potentially reconcile that before there's an embryo transfer and before it has any long-lasting impact for a patient. Yeah. And I'm curious, you guys have been doing this for about a year now, so I know you've got some data collected, and I'd love to hear more about what has been the real experience of the incidence of contamination and cohort inconsistencies.
Definitely. I've actually prepared a slide anticipating this question. So we started performing PGT-A plus last year. The data for 2024 shows us that globally we've tested over 20,000 embryos, and in the United States alone, we're about 7,400 embryos. Initially, when we first were developing PGT-A plus, we were estimating about 0.8% contamination and about 0.2% chance for an inconsistent cohort. And fortunately, what we've been seeing is actually a lot less than that. So the numbers that we're looking at right now are about 0.12% chance for contamination results, and even less than that for an inconsistent cohort. So in fact, we've only had one case so far, so the number is obviously extremely low. And this single case was a really interesting case that we wrote up and submitted as an abstract to ASRM, and we're presenting it here tomorrow as a poster presentation, and it's poster number 514.
That's fantastic. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing that poster.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you enjoy it. So Lauri, when we provide the PGT-A plus report, we actually bring those embryo QC results to the report on the results table with the goal of facilitating decision making. So I'm kind of curious about your opinion on this. Do you agree with our decision to bring that information to the results table?
I do. It's a level of transparency that I think patients appreciate. Patients, as we all know, are going through this journey. It's very difficult for them. There's so much that is out of their control. Their reproduction is out of their bodies. It feels like it's out of their hands. And to be able to have this QC information on the PGT-A plus report puts a little bit more control back in their hands and in their knowledge. It gives them a little bit more insight into what's happening kind of behind the scenes in the embryo creation and the biopsy. So I do think it's something that patients will definitely appreciate, and I think that the clinics and the embryologists will appreciate, because most of the time we're going to be delivering some reassurance, just like your data show.
Right.
Most of the time we're going to be, letting people know that things are going well from the time that those eggs leave the body,
Yeah.
the sperm and eggs come together and the embryos start to grow, and then they get biopsied. So I think that really what we need to do is, even though it may bring up a little bit of anxiety because there's a question of, well, is the PGT lab going to be questioning a process of ours in the embryology lab? We need to lean into that quality control. It's going to make our program stronger. And I know that when the questions come up, when providers are having to have conversations with patients about contamination or a sibling inconsistency, and there's a possibility for a recommendation for a rebiopsy, they're going to have the support they need from iGenomics to be able to have those conversations and feel confident in the information that they're sharing. And I'd love for you to talk more about the support that iGenomics gives providers with this.
Yeah, completely agree with you, Lauri, that clinics really are looking for our support and our guidance, and we feel very strongly about, we're passionate about supporting our clinics in both educating the provider to be able to understand and interpret the results that we're providing on the PGT-A plus report, as well as facilitating those those conversations with patients about that information, because it can be a tricky conversation. And I think it's important to understand that rebiopsy is a clinical procedure. And we feel strongly that our reports should support clinical decision making. So when we're looking at our reports, if we see a euploid result with contamination, we really need to rebiopsy that embryo, because that euploid result might not be from the embryo, it might be from a contaminated source. And so we need to retest that embryo to make sure that the result is accurate for the embryo that we are wanting to test. If the embryo is aneuploid, then if the NGS results show us an aneuploid finding, then it's more probable that that result corresponds to the embryo, and therefore maybe that embryo doesn't need to be rebiopsied, but certainly for a euploid embryo, rebiopsy is the strong recommendation. Similarly, for an inconsistent cohort, we don't know where that DNA is originating from, and I don't know that the result for the NGS corresponds to the embryo itself. So there's a strong recommendation to rebiopsy an embryo with an inconsistent cohort. And so this is the support that we provide to the clinics.
Thank you for explaining that. I think it's really helpful that what's on the PGT report is backing the recommendation that the embryologist or the physician are making to the patient. Because doing a second biopsy is a big decision, right? So it's nice to know that there's justification for it on the PGT report. I know one of the things that raises the most anxiety, not just for patients, but also for embryologists, is this concept of an inconsistent cohort check results. And I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more about how that might come about. What might lead to an inconsistent cohort check?
It's an important question and a good one. When we say that the cohort is inconsistent, what we're really seeing is that there's a genetic unrelatedness. And so I think that the knee-jerk reaction is to fear the worst, that there was an actual embryo mix-up in the IVF laboratory. We have heard of that happening, although it's extraordinarily rare. If it were to have occurred, that's something that we would be able to pick up with our cohort check. And the way we tease that apart is by retesting the embryo. So if there's an actual mix-up in the laboratory and that embryo is rebiopsied, we would see the same inconsistent genetic relatedness as the first time. The other explanation is actually the one that's more realistic and the one that is our default assumption, which is complete contamination. So with complete contamination, we think that the sample doesn't actually represent the embryo. And if that embryo were to be retested, then we expect to get embryonic DNA on retesting, and the genetic relatedness would resolve itself. And so then we would see the genetic relatedness restored between the samples, and so we would therefore conclude contamination.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for explaining that. I imagine that it could get a little confusing for folks, this contamination, complete contamination versus inconsistent cohort. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that just a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking for that clarification. When we are testing for contamination and reporting on contamination, what we're really doing is looking for a DNA admixture. This means that we see more than one genome in the sample. An inconsistent cohort, on the other hand, is a pure genetic source. So there's only one genome in that sample, but we don't see the genetic relatedness that we expect to see. We expect to see this sibling relatedness. And so when we don't see that, there's a few other explanations, but one of them would be complete contamination. So complete contamination, we can't know for sure is contamination, but it's not an admixture. So if it's an admixture, then we know that there's some kind of contamination and we'll report contamination. An inconsistent cohort could be complete contamination, but there are other explanations as well.
Thank you. Thank you for teasing that out. I think that helps. I think it'll help the audience as well. So coming back to the patient perspective, right? We were talking about the fact that patients are probably going to be receiving a lot of reassurance from seeing a PGT-A plus report that doesn't show any contamination and that the cohort check is consistent for all the embryos tested. So from a patient perspective, does that for them then mean that whatever pregnancy results from those tested embryos is a pregnancy that came from one of those embryos on that PGT plus report?
Yeah. At the end of the day, the patients want to know, is this my baby?
Right, right, exactly.
And PGT-A plus does give reassurance. Like that is the purpose of the embryo quality control parameters, is to provide this additional reassurance. But Lauri, you and I are both genetic counselors by training, and so the way that our minds think is in terms of also the limitations. So it's important not to overpromise or set expectations that are unrealistic for patients. So while the PGT-A plus embryo quality controls do provide that additional reassurance, it is up to the PGT-A report and the processes leading up to the biopsy and the testing of the biopsy. After the PGT-A results are released, is not something that any laboratory can really speak to.
Right, that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah. Well, Lauri, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that about wraps up our tableside chat. So I really appreciate your continued support as a key opinion leader for iGenomics, part of Vitro Life Group. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you.
You as well, Alyssa. Thank you.